Well, hello again, and this is now part two of our two videos on the mass media and political communication. This is the same intro slide we had before. We're going to pick this one up on how the media operate or how they are organized. We've covered some of the other material already. So we'll talk about the mass media as an industry. And as you will see, it is very much organized around large corporations that have become essentially conglomerates that own the media corporations that we see when we turn on the television or listen to the radio. In other words, we see a TV station, and the TV station is part of a network, and the network is owned by a conglomerate, and that's the way it has become. And these conglomerates typically own many different types of media. What they call different cross-platform type of ownership, where they will own radio stations, TV stations, movie production studios, book publishers, etc., newspapers. So I'll show you some of those examples of that in just a couple of minutes. The key features of the news media, which are increasingly crossing over into entertainment media. In other words, the distinction is not really clear. But the key features are private corporate ownership, and as I mentioned, media consolidation, and then we'll talk also about the important role of advertising in the as a determining factor in how things are covered. Government regulation. We'll talk about how that works. We have some government regulation of the broadcast media. Professionalization and what that implies in terms of the doctrine of objectivity and trying to separate fact from opinion in their coverage, which some do and really some don't. And then the distinction that I mentioned between news and entertainment. It appears that increasingly that distinction is less observed than it used to be, but we'll talk about that. So when I say, private corporate ownership, and what I'm saying is that there are a handful, 6, 7 big global conglomerate corporations that own many, many media outlets. And this one is made to look, this is a diagram that's made to look like, or a graphic that's made to look like a detergent ad. But you can see when you look at each one of these circles with a number in it, that these are major media conglomerates. So, for example, Disney. Disney owns an enormous array of media outlets of all types, and sort of Viacom. And there are shifting ownership patterns where they buy things from each other, like buy TV networks from each other and this sort of thing. But I'm going to give you some examples of that in just a minute. But understand that is the way things work. So when you see a movie or you watch a TV show, you're seeing something that was produced by some kind of production company, but that is in turn owned by a network or something, and that is in turn owned by a conglomerate. And now here's a cartoon that kind of makes fun of that. It says, in the interest of full disclosure, we remind viewers that the company which owns this news operation also owns your newspaper, the radio station you listen to, all your magazines, most of the companies we report on, as well as several branches of government and some key elected officials. And the man says you have to admire their candor. Because, these big companies own not only media outlets, but they also own many other things. And they often find themselves in the position of reporting on or news that concerns their own companies. So let me give you just a few examples. Disney Corporation, or Disney Company, which owns, and this shifts from time to time, but Disney owns ABC. And so they own all the ABC TV stations and all the news programming. It all comes from Disney. They own ESPN, the Disney Channel, and then, of course, the studios. They own Marvel, all the Marvel products, Touchstone Pictures, Lucasfilm, and the Star Wars movies, and on and on. And, of course, all the theme parks they became famous for. But they own so many other things. 21st Century Fox, well, then you have Fox News, Fox Business, Fox Everything. They have part ownership of Hulu and Roku, own National Geographic. And, within this, you find the ownership of numerous newspapers, such as the Wall Street Journal, HarperCollins Book Publishing, the New York Post, 20th Century Fox Films, and on. Time Warner, well, what do they own? CNN, HBO, Warner Brothers Pictures, Cinemax, TBS, TNT, Cartoon Network, DC Comics. AT&T owns, obviously, they own DirecTV. Time Warner, and again, there are sales pending at all times. These things move back and forth. Comcast owns Xfinity and owns NBC, including MSNBC and CNBC and all the other NBC stations, Universal Pictures, and on and on. Then they have stakes in each other as well. So this, and then CBS, here's another one. They own Showtime, not just CBS and the news and all the TV and radio stations, but Showtime, Simon & Schuster Book Publishing, the Smithsonian Channel, and on and on. Viacom owns Paramount, BET, Comedy Central. And, we could go on with this, but this is the way the news media is organized and the entertainment media. So the corporations that own the news media own the entertainment media as well. You can see what Verizon owns, among other things, the Huffington Post. Amazon owns Whole Foods, everything they produce, IMDb, and Zappos, shoes, and so forth. Alphabet or Google, and now Facebook, which is now, I believe, called Meta. Facebook owns WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook Messenger, and Alphabet owns YouTube, and so we go on and on like this. So a small number of corporations, very, very large multinational corporations, own many, many different types of news and entertainment outlets. And the news and the entertainment outlets are owned, in other words, by the same companies with the same sort of motives. Now, all this is driven by and paid for by advertising, as you probably know. But if you don't, understand that when you get a free app like, Facebook or Instagram or something, it's not free. It may be free to you as the user, but don't think you're the customer, because if you get something for free, you can be 100% certain of one thing. You are not the customer. So let's think about this for a second. Commercial, TV, radio, print media. This is an easy way to look at it. We could say the same about social media. But let's take commercial TV and radio and also to some extent print media. Who is the customer? Like when you're watching television, who is the customer? When you're watching the news, when you're listening to the radio, you turn on the radio in your car or something, you listen to it, who's the customer? If you think you're the customer, then I say you're mistaken. Because the customer is whoever's paying for it. The customer is who pays for the radio station and so forth, and that would be the advertisers. The real customer of TV, radio, and let's take Facebook, it's the same thing. Who's the customer? The advertisers are the customer. And now who is the producer? Well, we know we have media corporations. If we're taking TV programming, such as news programming, then, media corporations produce the programs. They certainly do. But what is the real product? The answer is us. We, the audience, are the product. So in the case of Facebook or TV or radio that we're getting, quote, for free, we are the product. That's why we don't have to pay for it, because we are the product that is being delivered to the customer. Facebook's customer is the advertisers. It isn't you. It isn't me. We are the product. They are generating an audience that they are delivering to their advertisers. And that's who they listen to. And so why does that matter? Well, because there's a lot of talk about bias in news. And, you hear, right-wingers claiming there's liberal bias, and you hear people on the left saying that there's a corporate bias. But, and you can evaluate that however you want. It's a free country. You can think about that any way you want. But one thing we know for sure, there's an advertiser bias. And what I mean by that is that any media outlet, whether it be TV, radio, social media, print, that fails to please the advertisers or that angers or alienates their advertisers is out of business very soon. And so from an advertiser perspective, what is good? That is the people buying the ads, the clothing companies, the hotels, the car companies. What is good? Entertainment. They want you to be entertained, to be in a good mood when you watch their ads, when you see their ads. They want you to be the right people. They want the ads to the programming to deliver the audience that they are seeking for. So, for example, if a beer company advertises on a TV show, they want the TV show to deliver them their potential customers. In the case of many beer companies, for example, it might be men between the age of 21 and 50 or something like that. I don't know, but I don't know the beer industry that well, but you understand. They have in mind a certain audience they want. They advertise on programs or on media platforms or on social media platforms that deliver the audience they want to sell their product to. They also want product placements, and you will frequently see products in shows, in television programming. You will in movies. You will see products placed there, and you will see people consuming those products. And they want characters in shows, if it's fiction, and if it's nonfiction. They want characters that lead us to want things, that make us feel we'd like to buy things. What's bad? Well, programming that's over the heads of the audience they want to reach. Too sophisticated, too intellectual. Programming that makes the commercials look bad. Sometimes programming's too good. It makes the commercials look bad. They don't want criticisms of the capitalist economy. And you will almost never see any of that on anything in the United States of America. No criticism of the free market, so-called, or capitalist economy is allowed. And they don't want their advertisers treated badly. So what that means is if there's a news show and they have an advertiser, and the advertiser is a hotel chain like Marriott or Hilton or something, they certainly don't want to turn on the news and see a show, a program, a news segment that reflects badly on the hotel chain that's advertising, do they? They don't want things that make people not want to travel and not want to stay in resorts if it's a resort company. So these are sensitivities, and all the people who run these news shows or entertainment shows are aware of this, and they know they need to be alert to that. So that's what we mean by advertiser bias, the sense that the people who create this programming and who do all the things necessary to put it in front of us in all platforms need to be sensitive to who their advertisers are and not making them angry. Now let's talk about government regulation. It's very limited, really, but we do have some government regulation of the news media. And I'm going to just give you a few examples. It begins with the First Amendment. It says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Now, there are exceptions to that no law business. There are certain types of speech, entire categories of speech, that are cut out entirely from any protection at all. And one of those categories is defamation. And I'll tell you about that in just a second with a couple of examples. But basically means libel and slander. Defaming people's character. That is not protected speech. And then things that are classified as, quote, obscene, end quote, which means, and this is defined by the Supreme Court. You don't have to worry too much about that. We'll talk about it later in the course. But basically, it has to do with material that is of a sexual nature, but not just that, but that lacks social significance and that is intended really entirely to be for sexual purposes only, no scientific, no literary, no news value at all. We'll talk about that later on when we talk about civil rights and liberties. But those, if it is classified as obscene, and it's very hard actually to make that happen, if it is classified as defamation, it's not protected at all by the First Amendment. It can be punished. Now, there are 3 cases that I would like you to know about coming from the Supreme Court. New York Times versus Sullivan, Neer versus Minnesota, and New York Times versus the United States, better known as the Pentagon Papers case. And then we will talk briefly about the Federal Communications Commission and licensing of the airwaves. Okay, so we'll take these cases one at a time. New York Times against Sullivan is from 1964. It concerned events of 1960. By the time I got to the Supreme Court, it was 4 years later. The New York Times carried this ad that you see there, which was paid for by the Committee to Defend Martin Luther King and the Struggle for Freedom in the South. that is Reverend King, had been charged with, I believe it was perjury in Alabama, but in any event, he'd been charged with crimes. They were seeking to raise money for his defense. And it has a lot of well-known people who signed it. And the ad was published in the New York Times. So, and it described in the text, which I know is hard to read, but in the text it described the things that police in Montgomery, Alabama, had done to protesters, and it said that they had brutalized them and jailed them unfairly and so forth. Well, the Montgomery Public Safety Commissioner named L.B. Sullivan, and he's the Sullivan in the case, although he was not named in the ad personally, but he argued that he had been libeled by this article because he was in charge, as the Public Safety Commissioner, he was in charge of the police department. So he sued the New York Times for libeling him, for defaming his character. And the Supreme Court held that public officials cannot win a defamation suit, a libel or slander suit, unless the article was published with actual malice. Now, that means something very specific. It means either the newspaper knew that what they published was false, or they acted with reckless disregard for the truth. Remember those words, actual malice, meaning they knew it was false, or they acted with reckless disregard for the truth. That means they didn't even try to find out if it was true or not. And that is the standard today. So that when media defendants, when newspapers and magazines and TV stations and so forth, when they say things about public officials or public figures, more broadly, celebrities, those famous people and powerful people have to prove more than you or I would. You see, ordinary citizens, all we have to prove is that the statement was false and that it damaged our reputation. But in the case of public figures, they have to prove more. They have to prove that the newspaper or media defendant had reckless disregard for the truth or knew it was false when they published it. And that is a very, very difficult thing to prove. And that is why public figures almost never are able to silence their media outlets like the New York Times. Now, in some countries like the United Kingdom, it's much easier to sue the press to silence them. Public figures do that all the time, and they actually recover. In our country, they almost never recover because this is a very difficult thing to prove. Neer versus Minnesota involved a man by the name of J. Neer, who was a very unusual man. He had anti-Semitic views, and he had a very strange newspaper called the Saturday Press. He accused local officials of corruption. They took him to court, and a judge issued an injunction that banned future publication of the newspaper as a public nuisance. But the U.S. Supreme Court held that it might be something he could sue for. Maybe they could sue him, but you couldn't prevent him from publishing. And that's called prior restraints on publication. In our system, they are almost always unconstitutional. It is almost never allowed that you can prevent publication, and that's called a prior restraint. In our system, it gets published, almost always. Although it may be libelous, it may get punished after the fact, but it gets published. And then we have the famous case of New York Times versus United States, or the Pentagon Papers case. And this is a very famous case from the U.S. Supreme Court. Daniel Ellsberg was an ex-Marine, a scholar, and someone who had been hired by the Pentagon, because he was very familiar with Vietnam, he had been there, to co-author a secret history that was not supposed to be released to the public. It was commissioned by the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. And he was trying to figure out, how did we get into Vietnam and how is the war going? And Ellsberg, who was quite familiar with Vietnam and did extensive research, he and someone else, they wrote it up, and it's a very long report, multiple volumes. It essentially says, it tells the whole history of how we got involved, and it says we're losing. It said we were losing the war, and this was in the late 60s. They were doing this study. And, the government was telling the public that we were winning the war. So here's this report that they commissioned, that the Pentagon commissioned from Ellsberg, and it says we're losing. So they decided to suppress it. The Nixon administration decided to suppress the report and not let the public see it. Well, Ellsberg and someone else who worked with him on the report released the report, leaked it. They made a copy, leaked it to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and also a member of the Senate named Mike Gravel. Well, the Nixon administration tried to prevent publication of the excerpts. They sued the New York Times to prevent them from publishing. Well, this went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court followed the previous decision, Neer versus Minnesota, and said, no, the report comes out. If you want to try to prosecute them, go ahead. But you can't stop the publication. No prior restraint on publication. And as you can see on the right, a few years ago, Daniel Ellsberg came to UIC at the invitation of my department. We invited him here to speak. He spoke to the whole campus. And then later he came to my judicial process class and spent an hour and 15 minutes telling the whole story of the Pentagon Papers case and what happened afterward and all the things that Nixon and his people did. They broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office and tried to get information to blackmail him with. They tried to have him actually beaten and possibly killed at a demonstration, but that failed, and a number of other things as well. He's quite a guy, and as an amazing historical figure, and played a role in one of the most important. The Pentagon Papers, the release of the Pentagon Papers, undermined public support for the war in Vietnam quite dramatically, and probably led to us getting out of the Vietnam War in 1973. So that was a very consequential act and a very courageous act. He told my class that he expected almost certainly to spend the rest of his life in prison as a result of what he did. It was definitely a crime. And the reason that he didn't get prosecuted was because of the burglaries that the Nixon people committed to try to get information on him. In other words, the government had committed so many crimes, they would have lost all their evidence, so they never prosecuted him. And now let's speak a bit about the Federal Communications Commission. This is premised on public ownership of the electromagnetic spectrum. Now that means over the air, broadcast of TV and radio. Well, this is becoming less and less relevant because more and more we don't use the public airwaves. We aren't using those frequencies. And the logic of the FCC regulation is that we have limited frequencies. And so if you're on, let's say you're on the AM radio dial or the FM radio dial, if let's say public radio is broadcasting on 91.5 FM, well, no one else in the Chicago area can use that frequency or they'd be interfering with each other. So these frequencies have to be regulated. Same thing with TV, over-the-air TV. You can't have two stations broadcasting with the same frequency at the same time in the same area. So it has to be regulated, and therefore they licensed them for many years. But now it's becoming less relevant because there are so many different ways, so many different channels. We have satellite TV, we have cable TV, we have internet, etc. So where's the justification for regulating all of that? So it's less important than it used to be. However, just to understand, I'd like you to understand something. The FCC for many years regulated and still regulates something they call decency. These people still need licenses, but it's not as tightly regulated. Indecency means, sexually oriented material at the wrong time of day and too much violence, that sort of thing. They've also had other rules. There was an equal time rule that said that if you had one candidate on for an office, you had to give the other one the same amount of time, that sort of thing. The key one, though, was something called the Fairness Doctrine. And it was in existence from 1949 to 1987. And it provided two things. One, that everybody with a license, broadcast license, every TV station, every radio station, had to devote a reasonable amount of their time to discussing and considering issues of public importance. Meaning all stations, AM, FM, TV, had to spend at least a little bit of time every day on public issues. And in doing that, they had to be fair. They had to affirmatively endeavor to make facilities available for expressing contrasting viewpoints held by responsible elements. Okay? That was called the Fairness Doctrine. And for a long time, radio and TV all did that. From 49 to 87, they did that. And so you didn't see too many extremes on radio and television, and you certainly wouldn't see stations that only cover one side of everything. But in 1987, the Reagan administration and under the took the FCC. They had control of the FCC, and they repealed the fairness doctrine completely. And that is what gave birth to the right-wing talk radio that you find on the AM airwaves now with people like Rush Limbaugh, where you could have a station that is nothing but right-wing talk all day long, and you can do the same thing with left-wing talk all day long. And the stations do not, although there are very few of those. But the point is, stations can be one-sided. They don't have to offer balanced portrayals of issues at all. That's not required anymore. Some people say, and many people in Congress have tried to reinstate the fairness doctrine, but it's unlikely to happen. Apparently, I don't think that anytime soon we'll see a return to the fairness doctrine. Now, I was going to mention professionalization, and that means this. Unlike with social media, where anyone can do it, to be in the actual news media for a radio or TV station or a newspaper or a magazine, you need professional background. There are journalism schools. There are departments of communications. We have one. People get degrees. They join professional organizations, and they try to focus on certain things. They try to be accurate. They try to offer balance in their coverage normally. Of course, they work for profit-making organizations, but they also have sort of a public service mentality. They try to serve the public, at least that's what they say they do, and they try to separate news and commentary. So when you look at a newspaper, you usually see the news is in one section, and the commentary and opinion and editorial section is separate. And that is a thing that is done universally in the American media. When they're giving you opinions, they try to tell you they're giving you opinions. When they're reporting facts, they try to tell you they're reporting facts. And there also are laws. There's no federal law, but there are many state laws that protect their sources. Those are called shield laws. So in most states, they can't be forced, reporters can't be forced to divulge their sources, except under extreme situations. However, there is no federal shield law. So in a federal court, reporters, if they refuse to reveal their sources, they can actually be jailed. So now let's talk about the effect of the media on politics. This is a scene from the movie All the President's Men, the famous movie about the Watergate scandal and its exposure by the Washington Post. A very important moment in the history of the news media. And I want to begin this by talking with you about the importance of media coverage of the Vietnam War. It's the first war that was actually televised. I mean, there were TV correspondents all over the place in Vietnam, all during the war. And they had almost unrestricted access to the war zone. And some of them were, placed in great jeopardy. They don't really allow that now. When the U.S. military goes to war, like in Iraq and Afghanistan, they restrict press access. They don't allow this because the impact of this unrestricted media coverage was ultimately part of what undermined support for the war, because we saw the real thing. Now, I want to warn you, if you are, the next slide I'm going to show you is quite graphic, so please, if you do not want to see something graphic, please, you can either skip it or close your eyes, because this next one is graphic. 1, 2, 3, here we go. This is a famous photograph of a South Vietnamese official executing a suspected Viet Cong man by shooting him in the head. This was one of the images that we saw. We saw images of the Tet Offensive, which appeared to show the other side, the Viet Cong apparently running all through openly areas that we thought we controlled. And I know they're images, and maybe the actual reality is much more complex than the images showed, but images like this and other things made us think we were on the wrong side. And you can think about images of other wars as well and how those affect our perceptions. Another aspect of this is the claim that the media are politicized. Every time this happens, when we see news media coverage of a war or any major political event, and the pictures are dramatic and the words and the images are powerful, we hear charges of bias. And normally we'll hear people on the right claiming the reporters have a liberal bias, and people on the left saying that the corporate ownership, that which you've talked about, produces a conservative bias. And there may be truth to both those statements to some extent. But there are other kinds of bias as well. I mean, I mentioned the advertiser bias. There's also what is sometimes called the bad news bias, or if it bleeds, it leads. That's a saying that you sometimes hear in the news business, particularly in local news. If you turn on a local news TV broadcast, it's like crime constantly. Crime, violence, car accidents, bad news. Much national news is about disasters of one sort or another. And that's called the bad news bias. There's also an official sources bias, meaning the things that they cover are the things that government officials give them information about. And also an entertainment bias. They love to cover things that are entertaining. This is what you see on the news, right? You'll see bad news, you'll see official sources, and you'll see so-called human interest stories, many of which are quite entertaining. And then sometimes you see what is sometimes called advocacy journalism or muckraking, that is, misdeeds by public officials. So these are all types of bias, I suppose. And so I just think the whole question of politicization of the media is a complicated one. It has a number of different aspects. It's not a simple question of, right and left. It's complicated. There are a lot of things that influence what they consider to be news and how they cover them. Now, this is where we have to look at who owns and staffs the media. We talked about ownership, but let's just look at them all as a class. All the people who bring us the news, they're controlling the flow of information that we receive about many things: politics, government, culture, society. They have a lot of power. Well, certain things we know about them. They are educated, they are affluent, often went to elite institutions. Sometimes they do seem to share certain perceptions and values. Sometimes it does seem that way. But there are other aspects to this. It's often portrayed, as I said, as this kind of left-right thing. But let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Because part of what's going on here is the portrayal of politics as a game or a sport, particularly elections. Listen, think about election coverage, how election coverage looks to you if you've ever watched any of it. It's presented as a game. Who's winning? Who's ahead? It's like a horse race or a sporting event. So the election coverage, political coverage, becomes like a game. The emphasis is on conflicts, on manipulation, on winners and losers, on emotions. And this is really how not just elections, but almost all political matters are portrayed. Think about how often they use images instead of ideas. Instead of explaining legislation to you, how they'll show you a picture that dramatizes it. And if you just watch any coverage of an election, and it all looks like they might as well be covering a football game. The candidates are portrayed in terms of their personalities, and these elections are big, very expensive spectacles or pageants that where billions of dollars are spent to put them on and promote them. Now, there have been a number of people, I'll give you the names of a couple, who have written a lot about this idea that the medium itself carries a message with it. First is Marshall McLuhan. He said the medium is the message. And what he meant was that the communication technology itself, that is, whatever technology we are using, whether it's a book, TV, radio, internet, the medium itself affects the way we think about it, what we're reading or seeing or hearing. And that in turn affects our society. So, for example, the book reader of the 1800s sees the world differently than the TV watcher of the late 20th century. And the 21st century social media consumer sees it differently than the 20th century media TV watcher. You see, the way we acquire our news affects what we feel and what we see about it. It affects our perceptions. It affects what we think is important. It affects what we think is right, wrong, good, or bad. And another sort of, I guess, maybe simpler portrayal of that is Neil Postman, who wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he just focused on two things. And maybe this will make this clearer. He said, until we had television, all media coverage of politics was done in words. Think about that. You know, everything people learned about Abraham Lincoln's speeches or George Washington or Franklin Roosevelt's radio addresses, it was all words. But now that we have TV, and of course, you know, we get pictures in other ways too, but now that we have TV, pictures have become much, much more important. Television and, of course, internet versions of video are now the main source of news about politics. It's pictures. The internet is loaded with images. And his point was that words convey ideas better than pictures do, but pictures evoke powerful emotions more effectively than words. So if we are getting our news coverage mainly from pictures, TV, etc., does that lead us to have a more emotional and less intellectual, idea-oriented way of thinking about politics? Are we then living, in a world of political pictures and images and emotions rather than a world of political ideas, which would be based on words? That's something to think about. And then if we go to the internet, moving onward from TV, there are some other aspects about it, such as instant communication, the ability to locate and link very, very small numbers of people. We call that narrowcasting. I'll talk about that in just a sec. But you can customize what you consume to your tastes. It's not like we're all watching one of 3 news stations. There are hundreds of different ways to get news. And you can pick the ones you want. Any individual can be a content provider. Some guy like Joe Rogan, who knows nothing about anything except martial arts, can suddenly become an expert on public health measures or politics or whatever he wants because he's got an audience. That's all he needs. And so this instant communication, the citizen journalist, the ability to locate and link small people to certain types of things very, very quickly is again a whole new way of consuming news, and it raises questions of how that's affecting us and how it's affecting our politics. That term narrowcasting that I just used is the opposite of broadcasting. See, it's where with social media you can target very specific populations instead of going out to the general public and hoping the people you want hear it. So it leads to things that we call information bubbles or information silos, where people can be divided along partisan lines or even narrower lines and just hear their own views reinforced all the time. And the cognitive biases idea means that we are set up as our brains are kind of hardwired to do certain things, to selectively see evidence of what we already believe. That's called selective perception, and also called confirmation bias, where we look out into the world and we see confirmation of what we already believe. Well, we do that anyway, but if we can construct our media world so that we're never confronted with opinions that contradict us, which we can now do, confirmation bias and selective perception can become even more powerful. And then I'll talk briefly about infotainment. This is a picture from Saturday Night Live. You see Elizabeth Warren and then the person portraying Elizabeth Warren. We have crossed the line where politics has become a form of entertainment. News and entertainment are crossed over. So we see so-called soft news that blends news and entertainment, and also the docudrama, which is a fictionalized version of reality. These reach huge audiences, and I suppose that's a good thing, that more people learn through a docudrama or Saturday Night Live, or they're exposed to people like Elizabeth Warren or whoever it might be, any politician, that they might not pay attention to if they were just in the halls of Congress or the Senate. But the content that they're receiving is different. It is entertainment oriented, and that is maybe a question mark, because some would say it might trivialize really important matters. So which is better, that more people know about it, or that it's been kind of dumbed down? You see, which is better? And these are trade-offs that we're seeing. A couple of more points. One, when when you watch any form of news, you see people being portrayed as experts. It's all over social media. People announce their expertise. I'm an expert on this. I'm an expert on that. I'd just like to encourage you to think about that skeptically. They use these talking heads all the time, but who are they? Well, many of them are attorneys, former government officials, consultants, academics, business people. But often they're sponsored or paid for. Often they're being promoted by an interest group. We don't know that. I mean, what is their background? And really, how much do they actually know? Sometimes these people know much less than they pretend. And so we always have to be a little bit careful about who we give credibility to. I'm not saying you shouldn't trust anyone, but I am saying we should be critical and careful about trusting people just because they claim to be experts. Find out, if you possibly can, how expert they really are. And then the rise of the citizen journalist. This is a very significant thing. As you know, there are lots of individuals now that go out and shoot video and have blogs and podcasts. They can use everything from smartphones to sophisticated equipment that's much less expensive than it used to be. And they can post content on things that would never have been covered before. They are often on the scene when major events happen, bystanders even. This can go viral instantly, and it can also involve video from surveillance cameras, from dash cams, from body cameras of various sorts. And so there's video everywhere now, and this has really changed politics and certainly policing. Think about the impact of this on policing in our country, where again and again police officers who used to be able to say whatever they want about an incident now are restricted, and often the truth comes out no matter what they want to say because it's on a camera somewhere, either a camera on them or a camera on a citizen or a camera just on someone's door. And lastly, a bit about journalistic standards. I've touched on some of this, but I want to just emphasize in closing that there is a difference between news that we get from citizen journalists and self-appointed experts and people who have created their own news sites and the so-called legacy media, the dinosaur media, whatever you want to call them, where people had to have academic training, subscribe to professional norms, they have editors, they have codes of ethics, and they have rules and requirements for how they deal with the sources of their information. You or I may be frustrated with them at times, and sometimes even the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc., are very frustrating to us. But understand there's a lot of filtering going on there that is intended to prevent us from being lied to. They sometimes make mistakes, but when they do, they admit them. They're really forced to admit them, and they are subject to litigation and that sort of thing if they don't. Whereas much of what we get from other sources, alternative sources like Facebook pages, has been proven to be demonstrably false and created to deceive people. So I would just encourage people to be very critical about where you get your news, and above all, don't rely just on one source. Try to consider different viewpoints from different sources and put them together. And if you have questions, this is something we can certainly talk about in class or when I'm doing office hours or so take care and of what you read. Watch what goes into your brain, and I hope you've maybe thought a little about some things that possibly you haven't thought about before. And that concludes our unit on the media and political communication.